Today we're diving into a collection I'm calling the most disturbing glitches in reality. Counts of moments where the rules of the world, the rules we all quietly agree on and never really question, seem to just stop applying. Some of what you're about to hear comes from forums, some from personal testimonies, some from eyewitness accounts that were never officially explained. Not here to tell you what to believe, I'm just here to tell you what happened, or what people say happened. And I'll let you decide where the line between the world you know and something else entirely actually falls. And before we get into it, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you know, and I've got a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Alright, let's begin. The door that wasn't there yesterday. There's a documented psychological phenomenon called place memory displacement. The brain's tendency to occasionally misremember the physical layout of familiar spaces. Scientists say it's harmless, a minor misfiling in spatial cognition. Most people chalk it up to being tired or stressed or just not paying attention. But nobody's been able to explain what happened to Marcus Webb in the spring of 2019. Marcus's story was first shared in a post on a small subreddit dedicated to what its members call experiential anomalies. Unexplained real-world events that don't fit neatly into any psychological, medical, or rational framework. The subreddit has a few 100,000 members, mostly curious people, some skeptics, a handful of researchers. Marcus's post, titled simply, "There Was a Door," became one of the most discussed threads in the community's history. Within 48 hours, it had thousands of comments. People weren't just saying they believed him. People were saying it had happened to them too. Here's his account, as best as I can reconstruct it. Marcus was 34 years old, working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Portland, Oregon. He was meticulous, practical, and by his own description, almost pathologically observant of physical spaces. That was his job. He noticed load-bearing walls. He noticed where pipes ran behind drywall. He noticed when a door frame was 3 degrees out of plumb. He was not the kind of person who missed things. He had lived in his apartment for 6 years, a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building on Northwest Lovejoy. He knew every inch of that apartment the way you know your own hands. On a Thursday evening in late March, Marcus came home from work, made dinner, and sat down to watch something on his laptop. Around 10 o'clock, he got up to use the bathroom. He walked down the short hallway, a hallway he had walked down several thousand times, and stopped. There was a door on the left side of the hallway that he had never seen before. His words, "It wasn't a door that looked new or recently installed. It looked like it had always been there. The trim matched the rest of the hallway perfectly. The paint was the same slightly yellowed white as every other wall. There was a small scuff near the bottom, the kind of scuff you get from years of someone nudging it open with their foot. It looked original to the building." He stood in the hallway for what he estimated was 2 full minutes, just looking at it. His first thought was that he was more tired than he realized. He reached out and touched the door. It was solid, real. The grain of the wood was textured under his fingertips. The brass handle was slightly tarnished, cool to the touch. He turned the handle. It was locked. He stood there for another minute. Then he walked to his bedroom, got his flashlight, came back, and examined the door carefully. The hinges were old, the same style as the hinges on his bathroom door and his closet door. There was a keyhole beneath the handle, the old-fashioned kind, round and dark. When he bent down and put his eye to it, he saw nothing but blackness. He knocked. Silence. Marcus didn't sleep that night, spent most of it sitting at his kitchen table, trying to think of any rational explanation. He ruled out the obvious ones quickly. He hadn't been drinking, he wasn't on any medication, he wasn't sleepwalking. He was wide awake, and the door was there. And it had a scuff on it that suggested years of use by someone whose foot was about the same size as his. The next morning, he called his landlord. His landlord, a man named Gerald, who Marcus described as chronically unbothered by everything, said he'd come by that afternoon. Marcus spent the morning working from home, glancing down the hallway every few minutes. The door was still there. He tried the handle again. still locked. He pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. Gerald arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus led him to the hallway and pointed. Gerald looked at the door. He looked at Marcus. Then he looked at the door again. He said. That was all he said for almost 30 seconds. He reached past Marcus and tried the handle himself. Locked. He pulled out his master keyring, the one he used for every unit in the building, and tried 3 different keys. None of them worked. He crouched down and examined the keyhole. He stood back up, pulled out his phone, and called someone. Marcus couldn't hear the full conversation, but he heard Gerald say, "No, I don't know what room would be on the other side of that. The building plans don't have. Yeah, I'll find out." Gerald came back the next day with a contractor. The contractor also looked at the door for a long time without speaking. Then he said it was possible, theoretically possible, that during a renovation sometime in the building's history, a doorway had been framed out but never cut through, and that the door had been installed on this side, but opened into sealed-off wall space. He said he'd have to open the wall to know for sure. Marcus agreed. He wanted to know. They cut the wall open on a Saturday morning. On the other side of the door was solid concrete, the building's original exterior wall. There was no room. There was no space. There was approximately 4 inches of air between the back of the door's frame and the concrete, and that was it. The contractor had no explanation for how the door had been installed there, or why, or more pressingly, how it had been locked from the inside when there was nothing on the other side. Gerald offered Marcus 2 months of free rent and asked him to please not post about it online. The comments on his thread were overwhelming. Dozens of people describing similar experiences, a window that appeared in a wall, a staircase that went nowhere, a room in a house they'd lived in for years that one day simply had a door in it that one day simply did not. One woman in the thread, a schoolteacher from Ohio, described finding a door in her basement that opened into her neighbor's backyard. Despite the fact that there was no logical path through the foundation and soil that could have connected them, she said she walked through it. She said the door was gone the next day. Marcus still lives in that apartment, told one commenter, about 8 months after his original post, that Gerald had patched the wall, repainted it, and that there was now absolutely no trace of the door. He said he still sometimes stands in the hallway at night and looks at the patch on the wall. He said the paint there is always slightly warmer than the rest. If that one settled under your skin a little, you're in the right place. Before we move to story 2, if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. It keeps the lights on in here. Trust me, you're going to want to hear where we're going next. Story 2. The Woman on the Roof. In the field of episodic memory research, there's a concept called a flashbulb memory. A memory so vivid, so crystalline in its detail, that it feels more like a photograph than a recollection. The strange thing about flashbulb memories is that they're actually less reliable than ordinary memories. The brain burns certain moments in with such intensity that it stops checking them against reality. What you remember becomes, in a very real neurological sense, more real to you than what actually happened. Researchers have spent decades trying to explain why certain people share the same vivid false memory. They haven't figured it out yet. This story comes from a woman named Diane Howell. She submitted her account to a paranormal podcast, one of the long-running ones. With a multi-decade archive and specifically requested that her last name not be used on air, the host was kind enough to share the full written account with his audience years later, and it's been circulating in certain communities ever since. Diane's first name is real. The rest I've verified as best I can through cross-referencing other accounts from the same event. In July of 2003, Diane was 22 years old and living in Chicago, sharing an apartment in the Wicker Park neighborhood with 2 roommates. It was a brutally hot summer. Anyone who lived in Chicago that year remembers it. The kind of heat that makes the whole city feel slightly feverish, slightly unreal, like being inside someone else's dream. On a particular Tuesday evening, Diane and her two roommates, she calls them Sarah and Pete in the account, were sitting on their rooftop deck. Lots of buildings in that neighborhood had them. It was around 9 at night. The heat had broken just barely, and there was enough of a breeze to make it livable. At drinks, they were talking. Normal evening. At some point, Diane looked across to the building directly opposite. There's a 6-story brick building maybe 40 feet away across a narrow alley. On the roof of that building, standing completely still and facing their direction, was a woman. This alone would not have been remarkable. People go on rooftops. But several things struck Diane immediately and simultaneously. The woman was dressed entirely in white, a long white dress or nightgown, something formal or old-fashioned. She was standing very close to the edge of the roof, and she was completely motionless. Not the stillness of someone who's paused for a moment. The absolute stillness of something that is not moving because it is not breathing. Diane pointed her out to Sarah and Pete. Both of them saw her immediately. The three of them watched the woman for what Diane estimates was between 5 and 10 minutes. In all that time, the woman did not move. She did not shift her weight. She did not raise a hand to brush hair from her face. She simply stood at the edge of the roof across the alley facing them. Diane describes a feeling she couldn't quite name at the time. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Kind of pressure behind the eyes. A sense that something about the geometry of the moment was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Pete eventually shouted across the alley, "Hey, are you okay?" The woman did not respond. They called 911. Diane made the call herself. She described the woman's location and appearance. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out. While they were waiting for the police, Diane kept watching the woman. She says, and this is the part of the account that tends to get the most discussion, that at no point did the woman turn her head. At no point did her posture change by even a fraction. Not when Pete shouted. Not when the sirens began to approach from several blocks away. Not when 2 police cruisers pulled into the alley below and officers got out and looked up. The officers saw her too. Diane is specific about this. She watched them point up at the roof. She watched one of them get back on his radio. They went up to the building. Diane's group heard them on the stairwell through the open roof access door of the opposite building. Footsteps. Voices, the creak of the door to the roof. And then nothing. After a few minutes, one of the officers reappeared on the roof. He walked to the edge. He looked down at his colleagues, shook his head. There was no one on the roof. One of the officers below looked up at Diane's building and called up to ask if they were the ones who'd made the call. Diane said yes. He asked if they were sure they'd seen someone. All 3 of them said yes, absolutely, without hesitation. The officer shrugged and said there was no one up there. He said there was no sign anyone had been up there recently. Said the access door had been locked from the inside, and there was no other way up. The 3 of them sat on their roof for another hour after the police left. None of them spoke much. At one point, Sarah said, "Did we all see the same thing?" Pete said yes, and that was the end of the conversation. What makes Diane's account particularly difficult to dismiss is the follow-up she included in her submission. She ran into a woman who lived in a building 1 block over, a woman she barely knew, a passing acquaintance from a neighborhood bar. This woman, entirely unprompted, mentioned that she and some friends had seen something strange on a rooftop in the neighborhood a few summers ago. A woman in white standing completely still. She said her friends had argued about it for weeks afterward. She named the specific building. It was the same building. When Diane asked her when, the woman said July of 2003. She said it was a Tuesday. 2 down, 4 to go. And they don't get lighter from here, I promise you that. Like the video if you're still with me, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Now let's move on. Story 3. Rewind. There's a condition documented in neuroscience called déjà vu. It's from the French for already seen, Most of us have experienced a version of it, that eerie, fleeting sense that we have lived through a moment before. Neurologists explain it as a misfiring in the brain's memory encoding system. A momentary overlap between the formation of a new memory and the retrieval of an old one. It lasts a second or two. It passes. But there's a rarer, far less discussed condition called déjà vu already lived. Not a momentary flash, but a sustained, overwhelming conviction that everything you are currently experiencing has been experienced before. In exact detail, in the exact order, people who suffer from severe cases describe it as terrifying, as though the entire present moment is a recording playing for the second time. James Calloway had never heard of déjà vu before March of 2016. He knows a great deal about it now. James shared his account on a personal blog that has since been taken down, but the post was preserved and shared widely enough that multiple archived copies exist. I've read 3 of them. They're identical. The account is also corroborated by at least one other person named in the story, who has since confirmed the events in comments on other platforms. James was 41 years old in 2016, a high school history teacher in a small town in upstate New York. He describes himself as a skeptic, a reader, someone who spent most of his free time trying to understand how things work. He was not prone to fantasy. On a Wednesday morning in early March, James drove to school as he always did, parked in his usual spot, walked to his classroom, and began his first period class. He was 20 minutes into a lesson on the First World War when he stopped mid-sentence. He'd said these exact words before, not similar words. These exact words in this exact order, in this exact room, with these exact students sitting in these exact seats making these exact small movements. One girl chewing her pen, one boy with his chin in his hand, another student at the back drawing in the margins of his notebook. He knew with absolute certainty that in 4 seconds, the boy in the 3rd row was going to drop his pencil. The boy dropped his pencil. James stood very still at the front of the room. His students looked at him. He asked them to read quietly for a few minutes and sat down at his desk. What followed, according to his account, was 6 hours of the most disorienting experience of his life. Every event of that school day, every conversation, every chance encounter in the hallway, every question from a student, every intercom announcement, every coffee he poured from the teacher's lounge machine he had experienced before. He knew what was coming seconds before it arrived, every time, without fail. A colleague stopped him in the hall to ask about a parent-teacher meeting he knew she was going to ask before she rounded the corner. The principal made an announcement over the intercom. James had mentally recited the entire announcement a half-second before each word was spoken. He describes the sensation as deeply nauseating. It's not pleasant, not fascinating, nauseating, in the way that a long, bad dream is nauseating. He kept waiting for it to break, for reality to reassert itself and deliver something he hadn't already seen. It didn't happen. At the end of the school day, he went to his car. He knew exactly where he'd parked. He knew that there would be a flyer tucked under his windshield wiper, a pizza restaurant advertisement. He knew that when he started the car, the radio would be on a news station, and that the first words he'd hear would be about a snowstorm forecast for the weekend. He knew that 3 minutes into his drive home, a gray pickup truck would run a stop sign in front of him, and he'd have to brake hard. All of it happened exactly as he knew it would. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for 20 minutes. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and I'd argue more disturbing. That evening, he called his sister, a woman named Carol, who lived in Connecticut. He'd planned to tell her about the day he'd had, but when she answered the phone, she spoke first. She said she'd been meaning to call him. She said she'd had the strangest day. She said she felt like she'd lived through it before. Every minute of it, the whole day, start to finish. She'd never heard of déjà vu either. James went to his doctor. His doctor ran tests, found nothing, referred him to a neurologist. The neurologist said it sounded like an episode of persistent déjà vu, possibly associated with temporal lobe irregularity. He ordered an EEG and an MRI. Both came back normal. James has not had another episode like that one, but he writes at the end of his account that there are certain days, ordinary days, where he feels, for just a moment, that same pressure, that sense of the world arriving in the wrong order, like a film where the sound arrives a half-second before the image. He says he doesn't trust Wednesdays in March anymore. And his sister, the last time they talked about it, which was years after the fact, said that when she tries to remember that specific day, March of 2016, she gets a headache so severe she has to lie down. She says it feels less like remembering and more like being shown. Halfway through, 3 more stories after this and they get stranger. Stay with me, and if you're listening to this on a platform where you can leave a like or a comment, I'd genuinely appreciate it. Subscribe if you haven't. Let's keep going. Story 4. The Wrong House. Forensic investigators and psychologists who work with eyewitnesses know something that most of us find profoundly unsettling when we hear it. Human beings are extraordinarily bad at recognizing when something familiar has been subtly altered. Change blindness, the research calls it. We see what we expect to see. Fill in gaps with memory rather than perception. We walk through our own homes every day half-blind, relying on habit rather than observation. But change blindness has a limit. There's a point at which the alterations are too substantial to be explained away, too numerous to be neurological, too specific to be coincidence. Robert and Linda Ashworth discovered that limit on a Sunday evening in November of 2017. This account was first shared by Robert Ashworth on a home and family forum, the kind of community board where people discuss renovations, neighborhood issues, and local events. It migrated, as these things do, to other platforms where it attracted significant attention. Linda, his wife, has separately confirmed the details of the account in comments on at least 2 occasions. Their daughter, who was 17 at the time, has not spoken publicly about it, though Robert mentions her experience in his post. The Ashworths lived in a suburban neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a home they had owned for 11 years. A 4-bedroom colonial, 2 stories, attached garage. They had repainted it twice, renovated the kitchen once, replaced the deck, installed a new HVAC system. Robert knew the house the way you know something you've poured money and time and care into. Linda had arranged every piece of furniture in it. On a Sunday afternoon, the family drove to Linda's sister's house, 2 towns over, for a birthday gathering. They left around noon and returned around 6 in the evening. Normal day. Robert pulled into the driveway, entered the code on the garage keypad, and they pulled in. Linda was first through the interior door into the house. She stopped in the doorway. Robert, behind her, said, "What?" She didn't answer immediately. The kitchen was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not ransacked by intruders wrong. Lustily, quietly, deeply wrong, in a way that was harder to process than dramatic violence would have been. The refrigerator was on the wrong side of the kitchen. The table, a heavy oak table that had belonged to Linda's grandmother, was facing the wrong direction. The curtains above the sink were a slightly different shade of cream than the ones they'd left that morning. The dish rack was on the left side of the sink. It had always been on the right. Robert's first thought was that they were somehow in the wrong house. He turned around and looked at the door they'd come through, their door, their dents in the wood, their slightly sticky lock, and he was definitely in his house. Linda walked slowly through the kitchen, into the living room. Robert followed. Their daughter came in behind them and immediately said, "Why does everything look different?" The living room furniture was in the same general positions, but the couch was turned an additional 3 inches toward the window. A framed photograph on the wall, a family photo from a camping trip, was hanging where a landscape print had been, and vice versa. The landscape print was not visible from where Robert stood. I found it later, leaning against the wall in the hallway. They went upstairs. Their bedroom was the most altered. The bed was against a different wall, not dramatically different. The same wall it had always been on, but shifted 2 feet to the left. Linda's nightstand was on Robert's side, and Robert's was on hers. The mirror above the dresser was tilted at an angle it had never been tilted at before. Their daughter's room was almost unchanged, except that a poster on her wall had been reversed, not removed and rehung, but somehow flipped, so that it now faced the wrong way, the blank paper backing facing out. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. The doors and windows showed no sign of forced entry. The security system, which Robert checked immediately, had not been triggered. The cameras he had installed at the front door and garage showed nothing, no one entering. During the hours they'd been away, Robert called the police. An officer came and walked through the house with them. She agreed that things seemed out of place but found no evidence of trespassing or break-in. She suggested that sometimes in older homes, settling of the foundation could cause furniture to shift. She said this with visible discomfort, aware of how inadequate the explanation was. Over the following 2 weeks, Robert and Linda went through the house methodically, cataloging every alteration they could identify. They found 17 distinct differences between the house they'd left and the house they'd returned to. Some were tiny, a book replaced on the wrong shelf, a spice jar with its label facing inward instead of out. Some were significant. All of them shared one quality. They felt like inversions. Left for right, near for far. As though someone had taken their home and very carefully, very precisely, reflected it. Linda told Robert about a month after the incident that she had stopped being able to fully relax in the house, that she had started noticing things she'd never noticed before, small asymmetries, things slightly out of position. She couldn't tell anymore, she said, which position was the original and which was the alteration, whether she was correcting it back to normal or pushing it further from where it had started. Robert's post ends with a sentence that I've seen quoted in dozens of discussions since. "The house is ours. I know it's ours. But some days I feel like we moved back into a copy. Story 5 is the one that kept me up when I first found it. But first, if you're enjoying this, please like the video. It really does help. And subscribe if you haven't yet. We're almost through." Story 5. The Voice on the Monitor. Here's a fact that most parents of young children find briefly terrifying when they first learn it. Baby monitors, especially older analog models, and some early digital ones, are essentially open radio receivers. They broadcast on shared frequencies. They pick up neighbors' transmissions. They occasionally, in dense urban areas, pull in signals from considerable distances. It's a documented, well-understood phenomenon. There are Reddit threads about it. It's explainable. What happened to Anna Frey is not. Anna's account was shared in the parenting section of a long-running online forum in 2012. She posted it with the title, "Something Wrong with the Monitor, Need Advice," and within hours, the thread had left the realm of parenting advice entirely. The forum still exists, and the thread is still accessible. Anna stopped posting after a few days, but her initial account remains and has been shared widely enough to become a minor, persistent piece of internet folklore. Anna lived in a house in suburban Minneapolis with her husband and their 14-month-old son. Her husband traveled for work 4 or 5 days a week. On a Tuesday night in October, Anna put her son to bed in his room, set up the baby monitor on her nightstand as she always did, and went to sleep around 11. She woke at 2:17 a.m. She remembered the time because she looked at her phone when she heard the voice. The monitor was on. There was breathing, her son's breathing, the soft, small rhythm of it, familiar and reassuring. And under the breathing, barely audible, was a voice. She picked up the monitor and pressed it to her ear. The voice was a man's voice, low and very calm, speaking in a measured, even tone. The volume fluctuated louder, then softer, as though the speaker was turning his head. But the signal was consistent and clear. She could make out the words. The voice was reading. Reading a story, a children's story. She didn't recognize it immediately. Sentences were simple, the vocabulary uncomplicated, The cadence, the deliberate sing-song of someone who reads to a small child regularly. Words like meadow and sleepy and warm. Her son was awake. She could hear him in the background of the monitor, making the small sounds he made when he was content but not asleep, a soft babbling, occasional small thumps of his heels against the mattress. He was listening. Anna got up and went to her son's room. She opened the door quietly. Her son was lying in his crib, awake, looking toward the corner of the room. Not at her. At the corner. The room was empty. She picked up her son and carried him to her bedroom. She did not go back to his room alone that night. She put her son in bed with her and lay awake until the sun came up. In the morning, feeling calmer, she tried to think through it logically. The monitor picking up a neighboring signal, a parent on the same frequency. Reading to their own child in the middle of the night? Reasonable, possible. She could almost accept it, except for one thing. When she was standing in the doorway of her son's room, in the seconds before she turned on the light, she had heard the voice through the monitor still in her hand. And in those seconds, as her son turned his head to look at her, the voice had said his name. His name, not a name. His name. The unusual, specific, idiosyncratic name she and her husband had chosen before he was born. A name that she confirmed later no other child in the neighborhood had. She sat with this for 2 days before posting on the forum. She checked the monitor. It was an older model. She tried every channel setting. She left it on for hours on different days. She heard nothing but her son. She called the manufacturer, described the incident in vague terms. They said cross-signal pickup was common. They said it could explain voice transmission. They had no comment on the specific content. Her husband came home that Thursday. She told him everything. He listened. He went and stood in the corner of the room where the son had been looking. He said quietly, "It's cold here." He then picked up his son, who had toddled after him, and carried him out of the room. That night, they moved the crib to the other side of the room. The voice never came back. Anna's final post in the thread before she went quiet was short. She said the story the voice had been reading, she'd figured out which one it was, a few days after the incident. She'd been telling her husband about the words she remembered: meadow, sleepy, warm. He'd gone pale and fetched something from the garage, a box from his own childhood, his mother's things. Mourned water, damaged children's book. The title was printed in faded letters on the cover. She shared it in the post. It was a book that had been out of print since 1987. Her husband said he hadn't thought about it in 30 years. He said his father used to read it to him. His father had died 18 months earlier, 2 weeks before their son was born. One story left. I mean it when I say this last one has stayed with me. Take a breath if you need it. Story 6. The Last Photograph. Photography has a strange relationship with memory. We take photographs to preserve moments, to anchor them, to make them permanent. But researchers who study autobiographical memory have found something troubling. The act of photographing a moment often weakens our direct memory of it. The brain, encountering the photograph later, begins to replace the lived experience with the image. The photograph becomes the memory. The thing that actually happened starts to fade. What if the photograph showed you something the memory couldn't? This account was shared on a photography enthusiast forum in 2015, and then again on a broader paranormal discussion board, and then in a long thread on a popular general interest community. It comes from a woman named Celia Torres, who was sharing on behalf of herself and her brother David. Both are named in the account because, as Celia notes, they discussed it at length before she posted and agreed that they wanted their real names attached to it. They wanted, she wrote, to be held accountable for what they were claiming. Their mother, a woman named Rosa Torres, passed away in January of 2015 after a short illness. She was 69. In the weeks after her death, Celia and David were going through her belongings. Her apartment in San Antonio, Texas. A lifetime of accumulated objects. It was a process Celia describes as simultaneously tender and exhausting, as it always is. Among their mother's things, they found an old shoebox of photographs, mostly from the 1970s and 1980s. Family gatherings, holidays, vacations, they half remembered. They sat on the floor of their mother's living room and went through them one by one. Toward the bottom of the box, they found a photograph they didn't recognize. It was a color photograph, slightly faded in the way of photographs from the late 1980s or early 1990s. It showed a living room. Clearly the living room of the apartment they were sitting in at that moment, because the window was the same and the light from it fell the same way. The room in the photograph was furnished differently, the way it had been furnished years ago, but the bones of it were identical. In the photograph, their mother was sitting on a sofa. She was younger, 40, maybe. Her hair the way it had been in the early 1990s. She was looking at the camera, and she was smiling. Sitting next to her on the sofa was a man. Neither Celia nor David recognized the man. He appeared to be about 60 years old. He had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a kind expression. His right hand rested on their mother's left hand. The gesture was warm, familiar. Their mother had been a widow since 1988. She had never, to their knowledge, had a romantic partner after their father's death. She had said so many times, warmly. Without apparent sadness, she'd said she had her children and her friends, and that was plenty. They couldn't identify the man. Not a relative, not a family friend they could place. They showed the photograph to their mother's closest friends and to several relatives. No one recognized him. They found no other photographs of him, nowhere in their mother's things, her address book, her letters, her journals. Was there any reference to a man matching his description? About a month after the discovery, Celia was visiting a friend and mentioned the photograph. The friend asked to see it. Yes. Celia had brought it with her. She carried it in her wallet by that point, unable to explain why. The friend looked at it for a long time. She said slowly, "Your mom looks really happy." Celia said yes. "Who is he?" Celia said she didn't know. Oh. Her friend tilted the photograph to look at it in better light, and then said something that Celia had not noticed in all the weeks she'd been looking at the photograph. The man's hand, resting on their mother's hand, the ring on his right finger, small, simple, silver. Their mother was wearing the same ring on her right hand when she died. Celia checked. She had photographs of her mother from the last few years of her life. Her phone was full of them. And in photograph after photograph, on her mother's right hand, was the ring. Small, simple, silver. Celia had always assumed it was a ring her mother had owned for years. Just one of those pieces of jewelry you stop registering. But when she looked back through older photographs from the 1990s, from the 2000s, the ring wasn't there. Her mother hadn't been wearing it until sometime in the mid-2000s, as best Celia could determine. She doesn't know when her mother started wearing it. She doesn't know who gave it to her. She doesn't know who the man in the photograph is. What she knows is that the photograph exists, and neither she nor David has any idea where it came from. That their mother was smiling in it with a particular quality of ease that Celia says she'd seen in only a handful of photographs in her life, her parents' wedding. The day Celia was born, the day David graduated from high school, the look of someone who is in that exact moment completely at peace. The shoebox is still in Celia's possession. The photograph is still in it. She told one commenter, about a year after her post, that she'd made her peace with not knowing who the man was. She said she decided to believe her mother knew. She said she decided to believe her mother had been less alone than they'd realized. And she said, this is the last line of her account, that sometimes that's the most frightening kind of mystery. Not the kind that threatens you. It's the kind that makes you realize you didn't know someone you loved as well as you thought you did. And that maybe that's all right. Maybe that's all right. Series closed 6 stories. 6 moments where the world didn't behave the way the world is supposed to. A door that opened into solid concrete. A woman on a rooftop who wasn't there when anyone went to look. A day lived twice. A house quietly rearranged. a voice reading a dead man's book to a living child, and a photograph of a smile that explained nothing and somehow explained everything. I don't know what connects them, honestly. Maybe nothing. Maybe something we don't have a word for yet. Maybe the word exists, but we've just stopped listening for it. What I do know is that people keep having these experiences. People keep sharing them cautiously on small forums and in late-night conversations and in comment sections where they hope someone will say "me too," and enough of them do. Enough people say "me too" to make you wonder whether the edges of reality are quite as solid as we'd like them to be. Thank you for spending this time here. If you made it through all 6 stories tonight, if you're still listening, please hit like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel more than I can explain. And subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be back with more. There's no shortage of these stories. There never has been. Sleep well, or try to.